I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from the battlefront, analyse developments in Donetsk as Russia pushes Ukraine back near Avdiivka, and we discuss the latest diplomatic and political updates from around the world.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 24th of April, 2 years and 61 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Brussels Correspondent Joe Barnes, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, and Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. So I'm going to leave the news that's the headline of this episode about the Russian breakthrough at Oshcha-Retenia to Joe, because he's written the story. He'll be on shortly. So I'm going to deal with the other updates, and let's start inside Russia. Fires broke out overnight at a number of fuel and energy facilities in Russia's Smolensk district after an alleged Ukrainian drone attack. So this area is near the border with Belarus. It's about 400 km directly north of Kyiv. So Vasily Anokin, the local governor, said our region is again under attack by Ukrainian UAVs. UAVs being drones, uninhabited air vehicles, unmanned air vehicles, somewhat old language, but UAVs, drones. And then in a separate incident, people were evacuated from parts of Lipetsk. That's still inside Russia. We're now about 300 km northeast of Kharkiv. That's after a drone landed on an industrial park there. Igor Artemonov, who's the governor of the region, said that there have been no injuries from that, no casualties, but that nearby residents had been evacuated as a precautionary measure. And then Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, speaking to the Kyiv Independent and reported by that outlet this morning, said that drones of the SBU, the security service of Ukraine, had been used in the attack on 2 oil depots in the Smolensk Oblast, and they destroyed around 26,000 cubic meters of fuel. Sources in Russian media and Russian officials also reported those drone attacks, standing the story up. They also spoke about other strikes in Voronezh Oblast overnight, reportedly also targeting Russian energy and industrial facilities. So Voronezh is the oblast directly south of Lipetsk, but you're still deep inside Russia, about 200 km northeast of Kharkiv. So these long-range strikes still continuing from Ukraine by the look of it. Now, footage of what was purported to be a burning oil terminal in Yatsevo, that's in Smolensk Oblast, is on social media. You'll be able to find that. And then the Kyiv Independent sources confirmed that Russia's state-owned Rosneft company lost 2 storage and pumping bases for fuel and lubricants in Yatsevo and Rozdorovo in Smolensk Oblast. After those explosions, a large fire broke out. Personnel started to be evacuated from the facilities, these sources reported, although neither the Kyiv Independent nor we can independently verify those claims. Now then, inside Ukraine, and Russian missiles injured 6 people, damaged residential buildings in Kharkiv early yesterday. This comes from the region's governor. The attack on Ukraine's second largest city damaged residential buildings, offices and a gas pipeline in the central district of the city. This is from Governor Oleh Sibanov. He's speaking on Telegram. And then the city's mayor, Ihor Terekov, told Ukrainian TV that 2 Russian S-300 missiles had been used in the strike, although we're not exactly sure what caused the significant damage to the residential areas. Now, other strikes across Ukraine have killed and injured across numerous areas. Regional authorities all reporting in this morning. So the Sumy Oblast Military Administration said Russian forces had attacked that area or that region almost 250 times yesterday. Miraculously, didn't kill anyone, only injured 4 people. I mean, it is extraordinary to see these kind of stats. But Russian forces also struck Kherson, Odessa, Donetsk, Dnipro, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia Oblasts, causing widespread damage but amazingly, again, inflicting no casualties. Just staggering. Now, I'll take a pause there, David, and hand over to Joe for his report from Osheretania.
Well, thank you so much, Dom. Joe, you've written the report. It's the title of the podcast today. What's been happening?
Yeah, so started sort of picking up senses that something was happening in this direction of Osheretania, which is a sort of tiny village northwest of Avdiivka, that town or city that was last captured by Russia in February. And that came through. There's this website called Deep State, which is a group of Ukrainian analysts, but it's a website best known for being probably the most authoritative daily updates of the battlefield lines. And they started showing these advances while Ukraine was claiming it wasn't, so the Ukrainian government was claiming it wasn't happening. But basically, we've discovered that Moscow has been able to capture the village of Osheretania in a thrust following the withdrawal of Kyiv's battle-hardened 47th Mechanized Brigade. So the 47th, which was formed to spearhead Ukraine's summer counteroffensive, it's equipped with American-made armoured vehicles. It operates the Bradley. It's got Abrams tanks. It was trained by NATO. It's one of Kyiv's premier fighting forces. And it was basically told, you can rotate out of the battle because you've been fighting almost for 12 months without a break. We're going to give you time to basically reconstitute, come out of the fight, rest up, and then go again. So after the culmination of Kyiv's southern counteroffensive at Zaporizhzhia lines, the 47th was redeployed to Avdiivka, basically to stabilise the Ukrainian withdrawal from the city. But over the weekend, as the 47th have been fighting, going backwards, withdrawing as Russia has been edging forward, I think the consensus is Russia has basically advanced, and there's like a skinny salient popping out northwest of Avdiivka towards Prokhovsk. They'd done about 5 kilometers in 10 days. And then suddenly over the weekend, Ukraine's 115th Brigade was ordered to go and replace the 47th on the front line just east of Osheretania. But as the 47th were pulling back, Russian forces, they basically had spotting drones in the skies. They do scouts looking around, suddenly realized there wasn't actually any Ukrainian soldiers defending sort of trenches, little fortifications. They suddenly launched an attack, which put them within striking distance of newly fortified defensive lines in the area. But these lines are crucial because they are defending basically a 20-mile wide area of undefended terrain leading up to Pokrovsk, again, which is and I'll go back to why it's important, but it's a really key logistical hub for Kyiv's defense of the Donbass. So Mikhailo Milnik, who is a company commander in the 47th, he's famed for being on social media, and he lost his leg during the summer counteroffensive. He wrote this on social media, and I will use his actual language. The drastic advancement of the Russians became possible because certain units just fucked off positions. Hope they get trained and retrained into stormtroopers. There's no sort of love lost. Essentially, we know that the gap that was created by the absence of 115th allowed Russia and its 30th Motor Rifle Brigade to essentially push along a railway line that's running northwest of Avdiivka, and that goes into Osheretania. And I believe, Dom, you want to jump in, so I'll stop there.
Well, I was just going to make the point after you finished, which I'm not sure you have, Joe, so sorry about that. This is interesting, and we just need to be cautious about what we assess from it. Defence experts I speak to, and this is in recent days, so not in the last couple of hours on the back of this news, I should stress that. But Western defence security experts I speak to are still assessing pretty much with one voice. They are saying that Russia is capable of tactical advance here. We've reported for weeks that they are moving a few hundred metres, a kilometre over a few days. This is a 5-kilometre thrust over 10 days, I think. So we know they're capable of tactical advance, but all the comment that I'm hearing from people who look at this stuff a lot are saying that they are just not capable, and neither side are, but Russia is not capable of an operational or strategic breakthrough. So yes, tactical advance, but it's been said to me, they are getting nowhere near the Dnipro anytime soon. The idea of taking Kyiv is just a pipe dream. So it just needs to be situated. Of course, you don't want to be going backwards, but we just need to situate this in what actually is really going on. And the mood is one of Russia's advancing through mass and through a very low moral bar, i.e. they have no compulsion about pushing people into desperate situations and losing lots of fighters, and also they are taking advantage of Ukraine's current shortage of ammunition. So that is not all of those things are going to stay the same. Hopefully now with the thing from the US and Britain that I'll mention a bit later. But this does not show some kind of Russian tactical genius. These breakthroughs. This is the battlefield outcome of all the issues that we've been speaking about for weeks now, about the material shortage, the manpower from the Ukrainian side, etc., etc. So just wanted to situate that. But I was going to do that at the end, Joe. I didn't mean to. Sorry to interrupt you halfway through your flow.
I just see some messages popping up, Dom, and I'm like, let's hand over to the expert. But no, seriously, like, it is possibly, you're right, that Russia has been grinding along this axis since capturing Avdiivka in February and has basically it's made ground, but not substantial. But this sort of substantial loss of ground by the Ukrainians has basically happened because there's been a blunder. This sort of blunder and chaotic withdrawals, rotations isn't unusual. But it doesn't always end in sort of land to this amount being ceded, purely because a lot of the Ukrainian soldiers they're civilians who are basically being trained to carry arms. They're learning on the job. They're not seasoned military veterans, a lot of them. But yeah, so going back, so the Deep State website, I'd probably say it's the most authoritative sort of regular updates of sort of the front lines. It's got links to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Its update today on Wednesday has showed the majority of Otrornetsy is under Russian control. Moscow's defense ministry claimed that Ukrainian troops have fled the village in small groups under heavy fire. Footage shared online by pro-Kremlin military bloggers has shown the Russian flag basically flying over the village. So Ukraine still claims it's fighting for the village. There are parts on the outskirts around the northwest and the corners there that aren't under Russian control, according to Deep State. So that's probably what the Ukrainians are talking about. So Milnik, the 47th Lieutenant, the commander I was mentioning earlier, he basically said the only reason Russian forces weren't able to advance deeper into Ukrainian-held territory is because the 47th basically turned round and started fighting back. He said the holes that turned out to be clogged by those who were planning to take recovery. The 47th Brigade is back in business another month and there will be a year without rotation. So basically he's saying that, yeah, they reverse ferreted, went back and used their knowledge, their fighting prowess to go and stop the rot. So Moscow has reportedly bought reinforcements from other parts of the front line, basically to support its troops trying to go through this village. But what does this mean for the wider battlefield? The Russian forces are now within less than 20 kilometers of Pokrovsk, which is a big garrison town. It's used to rotate soldiers and equipment. It has great sort of transport links to Kyiv. While it's been under Russian fire for quite some time, so our regular listeners, sort of people who watch the Ukrainian situation a lot, will remember Ukraine in the last month or so have lost a HIMARS rocket launcher system and several Patriot air defense launchers, which have been moved in and around the city. And they were the first recorded losses of those prized American systems. So that just shows you the extent of what is going on. So Kyiv's troops in this Donetsk area are fighting under mounting pressure. They've, as Dom says, sort of low resources. They're running out of air defense. Artillery shells are sparse. And this fresh US aid is on President Biden's desk, but it hasn't arrived yet. So further north of Otrornetsy, Russia has amassed some 25,000 troops. That's according to sort of Ukrainian military spokespeople. And they are massing on Chasiv Yar. Roland can speak about this. He's been there a number of times. It's a strategic settlement. It's on high ground. It would give Russia a foothold against a number of other garrison cities in Donetsk, mainly Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, but there's a few others as well. And basically, having control of Chasiv Yar would give Moscow's forces defensible positions to have long-range attacks. The Ukrainians like to call it fire cover. We just say basically it would be in range of Russian artillery, but several rail and road links, which basically are the main logistical connectors for Ukraine's forces in Donetsk. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for your reporting. We'll go, I think, back to Roland later, and I'm sure, Roland, you will have some thoughts on the pronunciation of Otrornetsy. But Francis Dearnley, can I come to you first? What have you been looking at in the diplomatic and political spheres?
Thanks, David. It's good to be back after a few days away. And what a few days it's been, especially with the Ukraine aid package finally passing the House of Representatives on Saturday. I know I wasn't alone in monitoring those votes live as they were taking place, rapidly refreshing my phone and liaising with people on the ground in Washington. It was quite an extraordinary day. And now, of course, as of last night, that aid package for Ukraine, as well as for Israel and Taiwan, has also passed the Senate. In an interview shortly after the vote, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said, "This national security bill is one of the most important measures Congress has passed in a very long time to protect American security and the security of Western democracy." In the end, the legislation passed in the Senate with overwhelming support, as we expected, with 79 votes in favour to just 18 against. Almost immediately, Joe Biden vowed to begin sending Ukraine new weapons as fast as this week. He promised significant support, including air defences. Quote, "I will sign this bill into law and address the American people as soon as it reaches my desk, so we can begin sending weapons and equipment." Tonight, a bipartisan majority in the Senate joined the House to answer history's call at this critical inflection point. Congress has passed my legislation to strengthen our national security and send a message to the world about the power of American leadership. We stand resolutely for democracy and freedom and against tyranny and oppression. President Zelensky, unsurprisingly, expressed his deep gratitude to the US Senate. This vote, he said, reinforces America's role as a beacon of democracy and the leader of the free world. I am also grateful to all Americans who continue to support Ukraine and recognise that the historical significance of this bill extends beyond politics. Ukraine's long-range capabilities, artillery and air defence are critical tools for restoring just peace sooner. He must be immensely relieved. This will come as a huge morale boost for the Ukrainian armed forces at what is, of course, a precarious moment in the war. Historians of the future will no doubt scrutinise the debate and eventual passage of this bill very closely. It comes months later than many expected, with significant ramifications felt in the military theatre. One question will be, what caused Speaker Mike Johnson of the Republicans to flip so strongly in favour of the bill being put to the House after so many weeks of obstinacy? I would suggest that Trump's open support for his speakership the week before last may have provided some vital political cover. Also possible is what is being suggested by some well-informed commentators on Capitol Hill, that Johnson spoke to many senior Christian figures from Ukraine who discussed what atrocities were taking place in the occupied territories. Whatever the reason, once it occurred, everything moved very quickly. In the end, as I said last week, that decision by the White House to compel Congress to vote on military support for Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan together did pay off, albeit not in the way they envisaged. The airstrike from Iran on Israel compelled politicians to confront the defence funding issue, obliging them to address the question of Ukraine at the same time as Israel. Stay with us, of course, for more developments over the coming days as we see just what Washington has been stockpiling for Kyiv. There are rumours that more attackers may well be on their way. Now, as I say, this won't come fast enough from the Ukrainian perspective. Only yesterday, after our broadcast, Ukraine suspended consular services for military-age male citizens living abroad, except for those needed to return to Ukraine, in what appeared to be a measure to boost conscription for the war. Foreign Minister Kuleba said in a statement that he had ordered measures to be taken to restore what he described as fair treatment for men of mobilisation age. He criticised those who'd left Ukraine before and during the war, saying, "This is how it looks now. A man of conscription age went abroad, showed his state that he does not care about its survival, and then comes and wants to receive services from the state. It doesn't work that way. Our country is at war. Staying abroad does not relieve a citizen of his or her duties to the homeland." Now, evidence of domestic challenges are also playing out in Russia today. Moscow has arrested a deputy minister of defense on suspicion of taking bribes. Putin, we understand, was informed of the detention last night. The man's name is Timur Uvanov, It's a rare move, suffice to say, in this context of war. The offence is serious. It's punishable by either a very large fine or more than a decade in prison. The real significance is that Mr. Ivanov is one of Sergei Shoigu's deputies, of course, the defence minister. So it's not a good look for Shoigu or for the Kremlin more generally. Ivanov is already under sanction from the EU as being the Defence Ministry's top official in charge of construction of military facilities. He was also the subject of a 2022 investigation by the banned Anti-Corruption Foundation created by the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny. It's said that the deputy minister oversaw and profited from construction projects in Mariupol. The foundation has therefore celebrated his arrest today. Now, it does bear repeating that one of the charges one so often hears about Ukraine is rooted in historic corruption issues, though it's worth adding that one rarely hears much commentary on the scale of corruption in Russia, which is widespread and is indeed a problem even for the Kremlin, albeit something that the Kremlin encouraged under Putin when he was rising to power. Indeed, some Ukrainians actually blame, in the Ukraine context, large examples of corruption in their country on the malign influence of Russian oligarchs over the many decades of Soviet rule and then the immediate aftermath of independence. So just some important context on this issue of corruption, which I think is often missed. It's not just a Ukraine problem, as it were, and indeed it is something that is arguably even more systemic in Russia, having been propagated by the kleptocracy. Now, just speaking of Navalny, we reported on the podcast how some of those Russians who'd attended his funeral were apparently arrested by the police in the days and weeks afterwards. In that vein, we learned today that the Russian Orthodox Church has imposed a 3-year suspension on a priest who presided over the memorial service. The Moscow Diocese of the Church didn't give a reason for the discipline, but it has forbidden Dmitry Zarevlanov from giving blessings, wearing the frock or bearing the church's priestly cross until 2027. At the end of the period of penance, based on feedback from the place of obedience, decision will be taken by us on the possibility of his further priestly service. That's what the diocese said in a statement. Many are saying this is yet further evidence of the clampdown that has taken place in Russia in recent months, with all signs of dissent, regardless of where they are coming from, being openly quashed. And lastly, just because I know this issue has caught the attention of many listeners around the world, a row is brewing in the UK today, echoing similar ones in other Western countries, with London accused of helping Russia pay for the war in Ukraine by continuing to import billions of pounds worth of refined oil from countries processing Kremlin fossil fuels. Government data shows that the record imports of refined oil from India, China and Turkey amounted to 2.2 billion in 2023, the same value as the previous year, which was up from around 430 million in 2021. Sorry, too much Roman history again. As listeners will know, the Russian state is the largest supplier of crude oil to India and China, while Turkey has become one of the biggest importers of Russian oil since Russia invaded. The so-called loophole allows Russian oil to continue being imported to the UK despite sanctions imposed, as long as the oil is refined in another country. So this isn't illegal. It doesn't breach the UK's Russian oil ban, as it's no longer considered to have originated in Russia, those fossil fuels. But critics say it undermines sanctions in the same way that those exported mechanical parts do that we discussed recently, albeit in reverse, with, in that example, Western nations selling to Kyrgyzstan and other states who then sell the vital parts onto Russia, whilst in this instance, Russia is selling energy to other countries who are then selling it to us and avoiding sanctions. I mention this, as I say, not because this is a UK-specific issue, but because this is happening with many other Western countries, and it's an ongoing debate about how sanctions are being avoided by the Russian state, and indeed how, given the challenges of the energy front at the moment, countries may well be needing to do this, or so they will claim. So it's relevant in lots of different theatres. But those are the main political developments today, David.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, Dom and Joe. Roland, can I come to you? Where would you like to cast your gaze on the news we've talked about today? What are you hearing, for example, on Ocheretny?
Ocheretinya, where are we? So I don't have on-the-ground stuff. I've just been messaging with a friend who's in the 47th. He's not there. He's wounded and he's back in Kiev. But he says, as far as he understands, and this is one bloke who's not there, who's chatting to his mates. He says, as far as he's aware, the entire 47th hasn't been thrown in there. He said he thinks that a number of Bradley fighting vehicles were thrown into Ocheretinya, but that most of the 47th are actually down south of there near, is it Berdichi? Is it Berdichi? Is that the place we were talking about? So that's as much light as I can put on that. I mean, I was looking at the deep state map, and deep state is generally reliable. It's obviously pro-Ukrainian. It's considered to be close to the Ukrainian state and security services, so it sometimes delays reporting of things for several days. But they've got a very useful function on the website. You can click back time-wise to see things. And over the past week, that little salient really has just spat out there really sharply in the space of about 7 days. There is a Telegram chat purportedly for people in Ocheretinya. I don't know how genuine it is. It looks genuine to me. Like, lots of towns have their little chats. And on there, one woman was saying, so what's the news in town, guys? Like, have the orcs taken it? Have they not? And someone said, is the fighting over? And one woman said, fighting's still going on. Someone said, well, are they in the town or are they just outside it? She goes, they're in the town, but the fight's still going on. So that was lots of caveats there. That is not verified, definite information, but that's as much as we know. The Institute for the Study of War, their analysis is, look, there's actually 3 little mutually supporting offensives in the same kind of area of a few square miles. This is the central one. There's one heading into where the 47th are, just south of that, and there's one going north of that. Their assessment is that the Russian intention is to... these salients are tiny by themselves, so their assessment is that the Russian intention is to unite them into 3 into 1, which would create a platform for perhaps a wider breakthrough towards Pokrovsk and towards the border of the Donetsk region, as the Russians call it, the Donetsk People's Republic. Again, we've heard Dom's strong caveats about what we think of what Russia's actually capable of and things like that, but it definitely seems like it was a scary moment. And I think, as everyone's already mentioned, we've been talking about this for days and months. This is what happens when you starve an army of ammunition, and when we also know they've got a manpower shortage. We've also talked about how defensive lines were not dug on time, basically. So these are all these long-term systemic issues, and we've all been talking about, well, what if it cracks and so on. And I think the reason it's getting so much traction is that, that jittery feeling that, oh my God, maybe that was it. Maybe that was one of the cracks that was about to happen. Maybe it wasn't, but it's definitely worth looking at. And Chasiv Yar, that I was so occupied with the whole Iran-Israel story over the past few weeks. I hadn't even noticed this Ocheretinya stuff, to be honest. Chasiv Yar I was aware of because it's just so logical. You can see how the campaign is going to build up. And Chasiv Yar is obviously the next Russian objective, and there's been reporting about that. The Wall Street Journal, I've just managed to get past their paywall. They have a dispatch today from there, and it's worth a read. And it talks about how they talked to one local resident who's like, 2 months ago I could just drive into town, which you could. I've driven there several times, especially during the Battle of Bakhmut. Now you can't. The Russians are much closer. It sounds like they're now in the network of kind of fields and villages where I stopped, like during the Battle of Bakhmut. So what was that? I suppose a year ago now. God. Chasiv Yar was the fallback point and the staging post, and we nosed out of there along those country roads until the hair started going up on the back of my neck, quite honestly, and we, the 3 of us in the car kind of decided, that's it, and we come back. It sounds like that's where the Russians are now, and as already described, Chasiv Yar, small place. In itself, it's not a great strategic game, but it is on this high ground, this large kind of massif of hills that lies between those 2 river valleys. And once the Russians are up on the hills, that's not all the way. There's still more hills between there. It's a foothold on the high ground, though. And you've got a few miles of fighting along the ridges before you would be overlooking that next river valley where Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka all are. And that is the prize in the battle for Donbass. That is the prize. Once the Russians can strike or capture, get into Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, that is essentially the core of Ukrainian-held Donetsk region. So a big issue and something to watch. And I think, as we all know, the Russians are going to put in as much effort as they can before this new American hardware starts arriving, because they know they've got a window in which to make those gains. So just a couple of observations on that. On the Senate has finally passed the aid package. I mean, that's obviously good news for the Ukrainians, obviously 6 months late, and it will keep the Ukrainians in the war through the next election, next US election in November, and somewhat into next year. But the question is, what next? Will there be more? And really, there's a much, much bigger question here, which is this vote in Congress. Is Mike... Oh, my God, this is embarrassing. What's this?
Johnson.
Mike Johnson, yes. His change of heart, is that the high watermark of the current tide of American isolationism? That's really the question that's at the heart of this. If it is, and if perhaps even if Donald Trump wins the White House, maybe he would change his mind about the war, then things are looking up for Ukraine, basically. But if it's not, and Donald Trump wins the presidency and he doesn't change his mind about the war, look, all these tensions in American politics have not gone away. And for that reason, there's also this big question mark of, can the Europeans and the United Kingdom and Ukraine's other allies and Ukraine itself do enough in that time to fill the gap? And there's a lot of rhetoric about that. We saw, God, I'm having a terrible day. What's the name of our Prime Minister? Rishi Sunak. Christ. He's talked about, 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030. It's positive, but it's there is still a big gap between the rhetoric that Western leaders are prepared to put into this and the scale of the spending, basically, and the money and so on that's needed to respond to this. And then in the bigger scheme of things, what do we think this means? The best outcome for the Ukrainians of this aid package for this year is to basically resist, to hold up as well as possible what we think is going to be a very big, grand Russian offensive this year. And then everybody you talk to about the war is already talking about the war in 2025. There was a RUSI assessment a while ago, it seemed quite well sourced, which says that the Russians think they can win by 2026. So we're still talking about a couple of years. And then you want to talk about peace, how might the outcome of the war be? Look, the key element that would make peace possible, at least from a Ukrainian point of view, is Western security guarantees. And I know you spoke to Dr. Oh my God, what's wrong with my brain? Radchenko, the historian Radchenko. Who? David Radchenko. What's his first name? Sergei. God, I'm so sorry. Sergei. About his article with Samuel Charap in Foreign Affairs, looking at the peace talks at the beginning. And the thing that comes away from that piece is that one of the reasons it failed is because the Ukrainians were looking for Western security guarantees that the West wasn't ready to give. That's still the conversation you're going to have. You talk to Ukrainians about, okay, maybe you can't get Crimea back, so on and so forth, as some people want to say. There are some people who say, I can have that conversation, but we need those security guarantees so this doesn't happen again. We're still not there, right? So that big question about how the war ends still hasn't been addressed. So those are all the thoughts still chugging through my mind. In ways, it's constant. And once again, as I always say, negotiations about ends of war, about peace deals, like a battlefield is a negotiating table at the end of the day. People say, oh, why don't we have talks? The talks are happening. The talks are being conducted by artillery units and drone pilots and infantrymen. And once one side's got enough of an upper hand and the other side feels like it has to go to talks, then the diplomats get their turn. But I realise I'm rambling now, but those are my initial kind of observations about the past week or so.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, Dom, Francis and Joe. Coming up, we hear Dom, Francis, Joe and Roland's final thoughts. All right, let's go first to Francis Dearnley. Final thoughts.
Thanks, David. Roland spoke a moment ago about the British Prime Minister's visit to Berlin. Can't remember his name, though, can you? This will be a big subject for us to discuss tomorrow. Just one quick update that is coming out of it straight off the wires is that Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said he will not permit Taurus missiles to go. There was some speculation there might have been some movement on that. Instead, he is calling on more countries to give Patriot defence missiles to Ukraine. But as I say, more on that tomorrow, but I did just think it was worth my saying that because I know, as I say, there has been speculation. Now, the other final thought I just wanted to end with today is that listeners will recall we had Shaun on the podcast a few weeks ago, the former soldier of the British Army who joined the Ukrainian armed forces and fought during the Russian invasion of Ukraine before being captured and tortured by the Russians. It was one of our most extraordinary recent interviews, so if you missed it, I do recommend checking it out. We'll add a link in the description of this episode. Now, in that interview, he mentioned legal avenues being pursued by people tortured by Russia, and I wanted to read an update from Shaun on that because, of course, it has ramifications in lots of different areas. Quote, "We've just been successful in a verdict against the Russian state in a first-step landmark trial which makes Russia accountable for their actions, including the atrocities they carried out on prisoners of war such as myself. A ruling in Kyiv found in our favour, citing breaches of the Geneva Conventions for the treatment of POWs and that we were inhumanely treated while in captivity. We will now let the legal process catch up and in several days look to enforce the action in the European courts. This is the first step in a long process that could open the door for other claimants and victims of war. This will not replace those lost since February 2022 or give any balance to Russia's actions, but it may just give some people hope moving forward by way of reimbursement for the way they have been treated or had their lives destroyed by Russian aggression." Suffice to say, we'll continue to monitor that. I mention it here because, of course, there's a lot of different work being done at the moment on trying to ensure Russia is culpable for the war crimes committed on Ukrainian soil. That goes all the way up to organisations such as the UN and other entities. But, of course, it also matters on an individual level. And we will have to see the many examples of this and the progress that they make over the coming months and possibly even years.
Thank you very much, Francis. And as we said, we'll put a link to that interview with Shaun that we did a few weeks ago in the show notes for today. Well, thank you, Francis. Dom Nicholls, can we hear from you next?
Yeah, thanks, David. So, money. Announcement yesterday, the Prime Minister's saying British defence spending is going to rise to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. It's this comes under the banner of nice problem to have. Okay, I get that, but I'm just looking at it and I can see the gloss coming off it slightly. So let me just very briefly talk you through this. So Britain at the moment is at around 2.3% of GDP. So adding 0.2% in 6 years' time, albeit they say it's going to be a straight line. It's not going to be a sudden, what they call a hockey stick, a sudden splurge of spending. So a straight line, but adding 0.2% in 6 years' time is nice, is good, but it's not quite, the numbers don't quite match the rhetoric with Rishi Sunak. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Yeah, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Yeah. Anyway, so the rhetoric of this is a moment for the world, this is a point that Europe needs to stand up, all that kind of stuff. You're Googling him, aren't you? It doesn't quite match that. The 500 million, which is outside of the defence budget, but the 500 million pounds announced yesterday for Ukraine, again, good, nice, thanks, keep it coming. That takes to, so it's going to be £3 billion a year, and they've committed to sustaining that 4 years to come. So Britain's going to be spending £3 billion on support to Ukraine, military support to Ukraine for the future. That equates to about 0.13% of British GDP. You'll remember that plan out there championed by it's an Estonian plan, and they are circulating it, trying to get NATO countries to commit to 0.25, so a quarter of 1% of GDP support for Ukraine over 4 years. That's a good number to allow Ukraine to plan and industry to plan for the future. So Britain, even with this extra 500 million and the commitment to match 3 billion a year from now on, is about half that. So again, it's good, but it ain't quite matching up to the rhetoric. And the thing that really worries me, David, is that all this talk about going up to 2.5%, so on and so forth, and how this is an epoch-defining moment. You may remember that in the spring budget here on the 6th of March, so just last month, the Chancellor, Britain's Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, he refused to commit any new money to defence. Okay, so he said he'd found 9 billion quid, a fiscal headroom, found 9 billion quid down the back of the sofa. He was going to use that to reduce national insurance contributions. National insurance, a form of social security here in the UK, entitles you to certain state benefits. The government, all this chat about what are you going to spend on defence? The government kept saying at the time they would go to 2.5%, and the quote was, when the fiscal and economic circumstances allow. Well, it only took 4 weeks, apparently, we're now led to believe, before these fiscal and economic circumstances allowed it. So I'm worried that there is too much domestic politics being played here. I said that Britain's announcement about all the extra vehicles and riverine craft and missiles and all that kind of George that I was talking about the last couple of days, they could have announced that last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever. They didn't have to wait for the US Congress decision to come through. So that seemed to be timed possibly with the US in mind, or possibly because Rishi Sunak is now in Berlin today and chatting to European leaders. So I just worry that there's too much party political stuff, internal political stuff, because guess what? Here in the UK, we've got an election probably in the next 6 months before the end of the summer. And I just worry that there is a bit of smoke and mirrors going on here. And whilst, yes, as I said at the start, it comes under the banner of a nice problem to have, but this extra money and the extra commitment up to 2.5% by 2030, it just doesn't quite match the rhetoric that's there to support. So good news. But the shine, for me, is taken off slightly if the motivation for this great change since the budget last month is a bit more nakedly party political. I know you're not going to take the politics out of it completely, but if it's too much party politics with an eye on the election rather than what's the right thing to do, then I'm just a bit nervous, David.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and Dom. Joe Barnes.
Yeah, I don't really have a final thought prepared, guys, because David literally called me 2 minutes before we went on air. But I'd touch on the spending. Dom, you'll remember when we were in Madrid for the NATO summit, when was that, 2022, that Boris Johnson stood up on a podium and announced he would get to 2.5%. So it's not actually, none of this is actually new. But also, it doesn't really change the grand scheme of things when it comes to the UK's position in NATO. So I was in the paper today, I was looking at, so yes, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, praised Britain for leading by example for increasing defence spending. But ultimately, if you actually look at the figures that were most recently published in the 2023 annual report, the UK spending pledge will see Britain become NATO's 6th largest contributor by share of GDP, because that's how we measure things in NATO. It's people want to spend over 2% of GDP on defence. But that leaves Britain behind Poland, the US, Greece, Estonia, Lithuania. Yes, Poland, Greece, Estonia, Lithuania have much smaller GDPs than Britain, so it's sort of easier to spend. And you look at Poland's proximity to Russia, it's a big spender. The Baltics, the same. Greece has been fighting a war more recently than a lot of us. So, yeah, that's why. But then if you look at the overall, sort of in terms of total defence expenditure, Britain is only going to remain in second place. And that is really tooth and nail with Germany. So we basically, between the US spends about 67% of NATO's total defence expenditure, whereas we spend 6%. We're basically in line with Germany. Germany announced its big 100 billion euro revamp of its armed forces shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine. That will probably see us basically straddle each other on second place. But it basically doesn't actually really contribute or help towards the argument that Donald Trump is making that Europe has to do more to defend itself. Yes, I think we're now at 18, potentially there's talk of 23 NATO countries are going to be hitting that 2% marker when the figures are released later this year, I think just before the summit in Washington. But still, America is basically doing all of the legwork when it comes to defence spending. So it's an open goal for Donald Trump. So going back to those figures, last year, and this is according to other, the US spent about 2/3 of NATO's £1 trillion outlay. That's compared to about 310 billion spent by EU countries as well as the UK and Norway. Last year, 11 of NATO's 32 member states spent 2% or more. More than 20 are expected this year. So yeah, it's sort of still a bit of an own goal that European defence spending hasn't reached sort of substantial amounts compared to what the US is doing lifting wise. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dom, Francis and Joe. And again, thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on. I did call you 2 minutes before this, having seen your article, so thanks so much for joining us. It was really good to hear from you. Roland, would you like the very final words?
Hello. I'll see if I can remember the name of our Prime Minister. But we've had a few in recent years. I mean, I think you've got to cut me some slack.
To be fair.
Right. What was I going to say? So that's quite an interesting point, this discussion about the politics of this, right? So there is definitely electoral politics. So this announcement by Sunak looks like an attempt to outbid Labour. And Labour have said, we will increase spending to 2.5% of GDP when spending rules allow. They refer to these things called the fiscal rules. And I ended up having a look at this the other day because I was curious, and I discovered if you're a lobby journalist, you probably already know this, right? No one knows what Labour's fiscal rules are. They're just things they refer to. I think there was even an article that actually begins, someone saying, what are Labour's fiscal rules? There are a few people in Labour who could tell you. However, the Financial Times reported that probably one of them is this. So it's the opposite of transparent. David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, so probably the Foreign Secretary before the end of the year, published an article in Foreign Policy last week where he laid out Labour's vision for foreign policy. He called it something like, progressive realism. And he was trying to, his philosophical architecture was quite nice and interesting. And he talked about channeling Labour's history of Bevan and Attlee, the Labour government after the war that set up NATO and bullied the Americans into having Article 5 and made sure that Britain got its own bomb and all of that. And combining that with Robin Cook's, early Blair year ethical foreign policy kind of stuff and so on. But if you look at the nitty gritty of it, and philosophical stuff is interesting and channeling spirits of different eras of the Labour movement and stuff, fascinating stuff. But when you get into it, what does it mean? It basically means continuity. You look at, was he saying, well, Britain will stand with Ukraine until victory. That's current government policy. What else? The AUKUS deal with the United States and Australia on submarines, that's current government policy. We'll have some kind of security deal with the Europeans, but not rejoin the EU, so not that far removed. I mean, it's all this stuff. I think really there is really very little daylight between Labour and the Conservatives on this. There is across the British kind of, call it what you will, the establishment, the deep state, I don't know, throw something out there, the system. There's a consensus that we're in a very serious situation. There is a consensus that we are going to have to spend more money on it, and yet there is a kind of a common reluctance to actually spend the money because no one wants to scare the horses. The economic situation is very difficult, and when you get to talk to people, I managed to get to, I'd have to be careful because it was all very off-record debate. People who are close to the thinking on this, the explanation is that no one's disputing that this is a serious issue. No one's disputing we've got to do everything you're saying, Roland. But you can't do that before you return to growth. And that, to me, as far as I can do, reading between the lines, I think both parties seem to grasp that. And, of course, the worry is that there isn't time for that. And there are certain people you can speak to in kind of defense analysts, people who live and breathe these kind of modern threats, analysts at RUSI and whatnot, saying, what are they talking about? You need to get going. You need to start Keynesian, just start spending and all of this. And I'm glad I'm not the person who has to make the decision because I can see it. But that, to me, is the kind of the political reality. And if you can spare me another couple of minutes, what was the other thing I was thinking? Two quick thoughts that come from my past week of reporting. So I've been looking at Iran and Israel over the past week or so. And one thing that came out of that reporting, to be absolutely honest, is how important deterrence is. Right? We had this weird duel between Israel and Iran that nearly turned into a full-out war over the past week. And if you drill down into it, what are the factors that stop that happening? It's deterrence, right? Israel's a nuclear power. It's got a nuclear arsenal, and it's also got a very considerable alliance protecting it and backing it up, as we saw. Iran has Hezbollah, and if they press the Hezbollah button, that is basically, until they get their bomb, that's in lieu of their nuclear deterrent. And that feeds into another general point, which I think the Ukraine war has made clearer and clearer. And I'm thinking in big macro terms here, like kind of movements, right? I think we are going to see more and more countries moving towards that hard attack, that really ruthless, no rosy spectacles here. What guarantees your security? It's having a strong military, maybe it's having a bomb. And that, I think, is a long-term thing. And a very final thing, I just thought I'd throw this out. I was having a conversation with a friend who has been close to certain bits of decision-making in various places. And he made this observation. He said, look, things don't look good now, but Vladimir Putin's actually had two very narrow escapes since this war began. The first was in September 2022 when there was the collapse around Kharkiv. And that would have been, all military logic would have suggested, the moment to massively reinforce success. And I understand, I mean, I'm not sure I can say this with authority, but the Russians came much closer to collapse, like proper disaster, than we thought. And you can remember the talk about nuclear stuff at the time, right, with the threats and stuff, and that tells you how desperate it was. Second thing was, of course, the Prigozhin coup, right? So wars are inherently unpredictable, messy things, and they superheat history, and black swans come along. So I'll just leave that thought there, because the longer this, I'm not saying black swan will come along and Vladimir Putin will disappear overnight or something, but just remember that we talk a lot about this is what's going to happen, and there's this trend, and we can see that happening. We can very easily be overtaken by events, and I'm sure we will be at some point soon.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.